Jake. All right, so what we're going to do is talk just a little bit about the parts of a fish, the external anatomy, and we'll also talk about their internal organs and sort of what they look like. So this is a picture, obviously, of the outside of a fish. And as we talk about various animals, we have some terms that we use to describe like different parts of an animal. And so there's 4 words that you should know. Okay? The head end of an animal, the part sort of towards the front, is called the anterior. Do you know what the tail end is called?
No, posterior.
Posterior. So we have the anterior is the head end. Posterior is the tail end. And then we have a word for sort of the back side and the belly side. The back side is called the dorsal side of an animal. And the belly side is called the ventral side. And this applies to basically all animals. When we're talking about things, you may say, you know, when we do our frog dissection, for example, say flip the frog over so the ventral side is up. So when we look at a fish, the external anatomy obviously has several different fins. They have different names, as well as some other parts. Fish do have a sense of smell. They have a nostril. They can take in water and sense various chemicals in it. Fish have eyes. Most fish have good peripheral vision, can see a wide range, but not great depth perception. Yeah, you'll have to draw on these lines, I guess. Now the covering over the gills, because remember the gills are very fine and very delicate, so they need sort of a covering, and it's a sort of thick scale. It's called the operculum. Okay, that's what this is. It's not labeled right now. The top fin in a fish is called the dorsal fin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Right now, we are going to go into shelter in place. We are going to do a drill for shelter in place. So all students, please make sure you go to the closest classroom. Teachers, you may continue teaching just as normal. Just make sure the door is closed. Thank you.
So that's the dorsal fin on the back side. Like if you imagine like Jaws or something, when they show a shark swimming through the water, the fin that's sort of poking above the surface, that's called the dorsal fin.
I've been doing it on the wrong side.
That's okay, just copy it on the front side or whatever. The tail fin of a fish, you might call it the tail, it's really called the caudal fin.
That one helps us steer.
Yeah, power helps propel it forward through the water. The fins that are just behind the gills are the pectoral fins.
Very see.
We talked about last week the lateral line. Raise your hand if you could remind me, what is that purpose of the lateral line across the side of a fish? Mary? Yeah, it senses motion and vibrations in the water. This is the gill cover. The technical name is called the operculum, but you can just write gill cover. Helps protect the gills that are underneath it. Yeah, if you ever like look up close at a goldfish or something in an aquarium, you can see it. It opens and closes. Why does it open and close like that? What's happening? Bailey? Yeah, as the fish takes water in through their mouth, it goes past the gills, and that operculum opens to let the water out. So each time it sucks water in its mouth, that operculum opens and closes. If we were to look inside of a fish, we can see the various organ systems that are inside of there. Okay? So that's what it would look like if you just cut away the skin of the fish. Again, the sides are the same. Don't worry about writing them again. You have it on the previous slide. You don't need to write it again. But again, if we start on the anterior part of the fish, you know, the brain of a fish is really pretty small. This is the spinal cord as well. And you can see the brain is kind of just an enlargement, an anterior of the spinal cord. Okay, so fish have a relatively small brain. Yeah, that you need, right? I'm just saying the parts, the size. The swim bladder's inside. You can see, it's right here. Actually, I can highlight it for you in blue. That's the swim bladder. Remind me about that. What's its purpose inside of the fish, the swim bladder?
So it can swim.
Well, you got to be more specific. What actually does it control?
The oxygen.
No, Haley?
How it floats.
Yeah, it's buoyancy. Remember, by inflating that swim bladder, then they float higher in the water and more buoyancy. If they squeeze the air out, then they sink down lower. And you could see if you follow the swim bladder, it's connected right to the outside. So that's how the fish can sort of squeeze air out of it if it needs to sink lower in the water. So you imagine if you're holding a huge inflated beach ball, it's pretty hard to swim underwater with it. But if you were to deflate it, force all the air out of it, you could just grab it and swim to the bottom, no problem. So the fish kind of has to regulate how much gas is in that swim bladder. And I told you about when we caught the fish and their swim bladder swelled up and killed them. Again, because what happened, it crushed all their other organs inside of there as it swelled up.
Sad.
Sorry. Fish's heart is on the ventral side, just below the gills. It's a two-chambered heart, as we talked about. You know the chambers of a heart, what they're called? There's two words. Cardiac refers to the heart, but the chambers that receive blood, it's called the atrium.
Wait, so are we supposed to like it?
And the chamber that pumps blood is called the ventricle.
They said we're not ready. So confused.
Then, what you see here, surrounding, you see as the blood comes out of the heart, you'll see these blood vessels. That's what all this is, blood vessels. And you can see right behind these blood vessels are the gills. So there's a lot of blood vessels right near the gills because they need to absorb oxygen. That's the purpose of the gills, is to absorb oxygen into the blood so it can be distributed throughout the fish. So there's a lot of blood vessels that run right next to these gills that are here. Fish have a stomach and a relatively short intestine where they digest food and absorb the nutrients, and then that exits the fish, so any waste that they didn't digest exits the fish vacuum. Jake?
I've always been wondering, why do animals have
Have what?
scales?
Why do fish have scales?
Yeah.
They're kind of protective against damage. Also, they secrete that mucus so they slide through the water. You know, in different fish, some have very, very fine scales that they almost looks like just smooth skin. Some have very rough scales. Some fish have like almost little teeth on their scales that protect, like sharks, for example, have very rough skin. So there are various adaptations to movement through the water and stuff.
Can you like cut your hand if you touch it?
I don't know. Did I ever tell you about, did I tell you guys my shark when I got chased by a shark?
No. Really?
I
Is
did.
that why you're a vegetarian?
Well, I'll give you the story. So when I was about younger than you, I was about 9 or 10 years old. My family was on vacation in Florida. And so one of the things that my dad wanted to do was take me on a deep sea fishing boat. You know, you could like, whatever, you pay the money and you go on with a big group of people. They take you out in the ocean and they give you fishing poles and bait and you fish. So it was fine. You know, I wasn't a huge fisherman, but I went. So we went out on the boat. It was from Miami. We set out and you go out in the ocean. So basically, far enough, you don't really see any land. They give you the fishing poles, they give you the bait, and we didn't catch anything. Some people caught fish, pretty big fish, you know, this big or so. But then as part of the trip, what they do is they have a raffle. They give each person that was on the boat a little raffle ticket. And the raffle was to see, they had some live bait, which is basically like some fairly big fish that you could use as bait on your hook to fish with. And so whoever's won the raffle got to fish with the live bait, and they would hopefully catch a larger fish. So unfortunately, my dad won the raffle for the fishing with the live bait, so we got to use that. So the crew of the boat comes over, and you know, they get like a pretty decent sized fish. They put on a different fishing pole with the hooks and everything, these big, huge, you know, 4-pronged hooks, and they put it in the water. And so we're fishing with this live bait and this big fishing pole. And so we're just doing a regular thing, fishing, and all of a sudden we catch something. And so, you know, if you've ever been fishing, you know, your pole sort of bends a little bit as you try and reel it in. Well, our pole was like completely bent in half, and it's like almost pulling me into the water. I could not reel it in, I couldn't pull it in, my dad couldn't, so finally the crew members of the boat come over to give us a hand. So obviously it's like a pretty big sized fish. So, you know, they reel it in and then they like pull it and they reel it in and pull it and they're getting it closer and closer and closer. And so eventually they have this fish, and you could see in the water, it's something big, and they reel it in so that it's like right next to the side of our boat. So like if I were leaning over the boat, it's right there, and it's about 3 or 4 feet down, and it's a shark. It's a hammerhead shark. So one of those sharks, they have the eyes on the side of their thing, like really scary, and it's big. It's like 5.5, 6 feet. That's my memory of it. I was about 4 feet tall or something. So they have this fish, and so it's not like a little perch that you like, you know, reel it up the line, it's dangling there, and you just toss it in the boat. It's like, how do you get this, you know, 150-pound fish into this boat? You can't reel it in on the line. So I have no idea what they're going to do. So the crew members, one of the guy holds the fish there, he's got it on the line, and the other guys go in their tool area, and they come out and they have like a broomstick handle, but then at the end is just this huge hook like this. And they get out 2 of these things. And so these 2 crew members, they go over like to the side of the boat with these giant broomsticks with a hook on it, and they lean over and they just smash it into the side of the shark so it like stabs a hole in the side of the shark like that. You know, it takes them a couple swings to really get it stuck in there. So they swing a couple times and they get the hooks like embedded, and then they have to like say, okay, 1, 2, 3, and they both like pull together and flop this huge hammerhead shark onto the deck of the boat as I'm standing right there. So then I start crying, right? 'Cause it's scary. I'm 10 years old. It's scary. So blood is gushing out of these 2 wounds from it. And then it's really mad, right? Because they just poked 2 holes in it. It's not dead. It's still alive. And it starts flopping around the deck of the boat. And I'm running away from it down the deck of the boat. And it's flopping around to try and chase me down the deck to try and eat me. So then, right, so what is the next step in the story, you think?
Jump in the water.
I would have liked to, but I didn't. I was
Shoot
too
it.
scared to do that. They got to kill the thing.
Oh.
So I'm like, I don't know, how do they do that? And they don't just let it flop around the boat until it dies. They go back in their little tool shed and they come out with 2 baseball bats.
Oh my God.
And then the 2 crew members just take turns, one after the other, smashing the shark in the head with baseball bats until it finally stops moving and is dead and is bleeding all over the place. And I never recovered. I cried the whole trip home. And they said that, so finally we got back, they put in this big tub. I have a picture, I'll find it, I'll show you guys. They put in this big cooler tub thing. It's all bloody and gross in there. And then we get off the boat and they say, okay, well, what do you want us to do with your shark that you guys caught? And so we just ended up giving it to somebody else on the boat because I didn't want anything to do with it after that experience. So yeah, I was attacked by a shark. That's my being attacked by a shark story.
Me too.
Mary?
Thank you, everyone. The shelter in place is now lifted. Thank you.
What?
Go. Can I get a drink?
Gobies? Oh, yeah.
So they have like really soft. So like, what do they even have any scales?
Yeah, some fish just have like microscopic almost scales, very, very smooth, that it doesn't even look like there's any scales there. Like carp, I think also have carp have large scales.
Yeah,
What's the fish I'm thinking of? I'm not sure, but they're almost like you don't see scales, it just looks like skin. All right, so any questions about fish?
No. I didn't think before you see that, honestly.
It was pretty comical if you were watching from the outside, I guess. I'll find my picture of the bloody shark someday and show you guys. Anthony. Yeah. All right, let's move into amphibians. Amphibians. So we're doing our classes of vertebrates in order of evolution. Fish were the first vertebrates. And for a long time on Earth, there were only fish. They were only vertebrates. But eventually there evolved a group of fish that were able to do something that eventually turned into amphibians. What was that adaptation? Right?
Walking.
Yeah, they were able to move on to land. And that it did sort of require feet in a way, even though some fish can actually use their flippers to walk on land. Like, have you ever heard of a mud skipper?
No.
It's a fish that can actually get oxygen from the air. And they actually sometimes make their way from one pond to another by crawling over the land using their flippers, their fins. So they needed to be able to move on land, but what else was even more important? Ready? Yeah, that they could breathe air, because fish can't breathe air. Okay? So the development of lungs was a big step into allowing fish to evolve, some fish, to become amphibians. The word amphibian comes from two words, ampha and bios. It means double life. Because amphibians can live in land and on water. And they go through a process called metamorphosis, which we'll talk about. So what are amphibians? Give me an example of one. Olivia? Frogs, salamanders, and something similar to a frog. Caleb? No, they're reptiles. A lot of people will confuse amphibians and reptiles. There's some important differences that we'll talk about though. So frogs, salamanders, and this one you probably just think is a frog. Nevaeh?
Iguana. Toad.
Yeah, toad. Frogs, toads, and salamanders and newts. So frogs generally, what's the difference between a frog and a toad? Frogs usually have much thinner skin. Okay? They have longer hind legs. Toads usually are dry. They have thicker, bumpier skin, more waterproof. Okay? Shorter legs. Can toads give you warts?
No. Yes.
No.
No.
They give you diseases.
It's an all lifestyle. They cannot.
They give you disease.
Ugly.
A toad is a wart is caused by a virus. Actually, Caleb.
What about snakes?
Reptile. Jake.
Oh, like, I have I think like it's related to toads, because I was at my cousin's house one time, and we were at like, this party, and I saw this toad on the ground, and I picked it up, and my dad started yelling at me to wash my hands, and I started crying and all that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you can pick up toads all the time. Find them. We used to when we go camping. We always find little tiny toads. What? They live in the forest. They can live, but they won't go. They won't go too far from the water because all amphibians require water at least for one part of their life. What part do you think that is?
After.
They're born.
Yeah, for reproduction. Amphibians need water for reproduction. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, what's that? Frog, poison dart frog. Okay, lots of amphibians some amphibians have poison that they secrete to help protect them from predators. But also they're brightly colored to advertise. Hey, don't eat me. I'm poisonous. I don't taste very good. Because it's not helpful for a frog if it's poisonous, if it gets eaten and then the thing that ate it dies. That's not very helpful, right? Because you're dead. You got to eat it. But it's more helpful if you can advertise the fact that you're poisonous so things avoid eating you in the first place. A toad, salamander, tree frog. Saw these when I was in Costa Rica last year.
Oh, what did I see? I saw what are those things? Geckos.
Geckos, yeah, you see, they're reptiles though. You see those around Florida.
Yeah, I saw
Invertebrates. They're crustaceans. All right, so as we talk about our vertebrate classes, we talk about their body temperature. What were fish? What kind of body temperature do we say? Cold-blooded. Amphibians also are cold-blooded, meaning their body temperature depends on their surroundings. They don't generate body heat internally. So over the winter around here, where are frogs and toads and salamanders? Caleb? Hibernating. They hibernate. They find a place. We'll talk a little bit more about that after. But because it's cold, their body temperature gets very low, and they can't be very active. Okay? Their cell processes and their metabolism slows way down. I know that some of you in English class maybe, did you read an article or something about a person that drowned, right?
Oh, yeah. Drowned for like an hour.
Yeah. So part of that has to do with what we're talking about. Yeah. And you read about this every once in a while. Every once in a while, a person may fall through the ice somewhere into a very, very cold water, and they'll drown. But if they're pulled out often, if it's very cold water, they can be resuscitated after a much longer time versus somebody that drowned under normal conditions when it's not cold. because part of that being very, very cold slows down all of the body processes that sort of our cells needing energy and requiring oxygen. So all of that slows down under very cold conditions, and a person can survive much longer under cold conditions versus under warm conditions. In fact, some people even have chosen that after they contract with a company, there's companies that do this, that after they die, they will be frozen. Cryogenic, it's called cryogenics. They'll be cryogenically frozen for a period of time, and their hope is that someday in whatever, 1,000 years, or 1,500 years, or 10,000 years, scientists will have figured out ways of fixing whatever caused them to die, or fix any problems and allow them to be brought out of that frozen state and be sort of resuscitated, and they would be alive again. So it's never been actually done, but people say, well, who knows what could happen in 10,000 years, and they choose to do that.
Well, I'll be dead,
Caleb?
so.
Wouldn't they die instantly though, 'cause they're so.
Yeah, they do it usually after they pass away. They have a contract that they're, as soon as possible, they're put in this cryogenic container.
If they were frozen and then they brought them back to life, would they like die right away instantly again?
Yeah, well, what they think is, well, in 10,000 years, scientists will figure out that I won't be dead anymore, and they have some sort of things that they can do. So they're just sort of, I guess, hoping.
There's something good in that.
Yeah.
What if-
All right. So just like we talked about, insects go through a process of metamorphosis. Frogs also do. How many people have seen tadpoles? Yeah. So tadpoles are the beginning stage of a frog. We start with the eggs, which hatch into tadpoles. They look like little fish. They have gills. They can breathe in the water. They have fins. They swim through the water. They don't have any legs. They look a lot like a fish, but they're not. They're amphibians.
Can we like raise the
We're going to see them, though, preserved examples of different stages of frog metamorphosis tomorrow or Thursday. So those tadpoles have gills, but as they grow and mature, they start to change. They start to grow legs. Their tail starts getting shorter and shorter. Their gills begin to disappear, and they start to form another organ. What starts to form?
Lungs.
Lungs. And eventually they look much like a frog. The tail, the froglet still has like a little bit of a tail left, but they're able to move on to land now because they have lungs. And eventually they mature into a full adult frog who can then lay eggs and reproduce and start the cycle over again.
What's a tadpole with legs? Are they underwater?
Yeah, they still are in the water. The legs start forming. It's like, and you know, it's not like stages. It's gradually. The tail shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. The limbs, the hind legs start growing. So it happens sort of.
But do they have to like go up to the surface and get air?
Eventually, once their lungs are formed and their gills are gone, they have to breathe air. Although frogs, like we'll talk about here, can actually get oxygen through their skin as well. Okay? So we talked about fish hearts. How many chambers were there in a fish heart? Two chambers, an atrium and a ventricle. An atrium to receive blood, a ventricle to pump it out. Amphibians have a little bit more advanced heart. They have a 3-chambered heart. There's 2 atrium, a left atrium and a right atrium, and then a ventricle on the bottom. This helps to get more oxygenated blood to their cells because there's not as much mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So they're kept separate for most of the time until they meet in the ventricle. As we move on and talk about the other classes, you'll see that other animals, like mammals, how many chambers in our heart? Yeah, we have a 4-chambered heart. So we have no mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Amphibians get their oxygen through 3 means. Through their skin, through lungs, or through gills, depending on what stage in the life we're talking about. So through their skin, they can get oxygen through their skin at all times. Because underneath their skin, it's very, very thin, and underneath there are all of these blood vessels. When we eventually do our frog dissection, you're going to see underneath the skin of the frog, it's filled with blood vessels that are used to absorb oxygen. Some frogs even live most of their life underwater, absorbing oxygen through their skin, like the African clawed frog, I think. You can put in an aquarium, it just lives in the water. It's an aquatic frog. Okay?
When do you guys have their frogs?
Not for till the next unit. And so they can breathe their skin when they're a tadpole or when they're adult, throughout their life. When they are in the tadpole stage, they can use their gills. They're only there when it's tadpole. And gills are adapted to get oxygen out of what?
Water.
Water. To get oxygen out of the water.
Bless you.
And then eventually, as they mature into the adult stage, they start using their lungs, which are obviously adapted getting oxygen out of the air. In our last slide, as we talked about, amphibians often hibernate. What's the point of hibernating? Why wouldn't frogs just still be around, hop around the snow, doing their normal thing? Why do they have to hibernate? Jake?
Well, I have two guesses. So one, I think that they need the snow kind of like drain their wetness.
Okay.
And the other one is that there's not much food around.
Yeah, that's probably the important one, is that there's nothing for them to eat, okay, right now. There's no insects or anything for those frogs. There's no worms around. So they have no real food. So often animals that can't get enough food in the winter go through a period of hibernation. Or they might migrate like birds do and move somewhere else for a while.
Is it possible to die while you're
Excuse me?
Is it possible to die while you're hibernating?
Yeah, I guess it probably is. So hibernation is kind of like it's almost like sleep, a deep state of sleep. And it's basically when all of the body processes slow down. And the frog doesn't really need anything. It doesn't need very much oxygen. It's conserving its energy until spring, when it can emerge from hibernation and actually get some food.
Can it pick up though? Like if you pick it up.
It depends. There's different types of hibernation. Like, for example, bears don't really hibernate in a true sense. They get up at various times throughout the winter and can move around and stuff. But frogs, it's more of a definitely they're hibernating, they're dormant. Because also remember, when it's so cold, because they're cold-blooded, their body temperature is cold. They can't be active. It's just their body's moving too slow. In the time when they're hibernating, they live off of these organs called fat bodies. This is the inside of a frog. These yellowish orange things you see here, they look like a bunch of bananas. Those are organs called fat bodies. And as a frog is eating lots of delicious insects over the spring and summer, any extra energy it gets, it stores up in these fat bodies. Okay? And then as it hibernates, it uses the energy stored up to keep it alive. So it still does need some energy, and it lives off of those fat bodies. Finally, reproduction. We said, you guys told me earlier, like fish, frogs have external fertilization. A female frog lays eggs in the water. A male fertilizes them in the water. And then they grow in the water. So they have external fertilization and external development. Usually it's in the springtime, like most animals that live in sort of northern climates. They reproduce in the spring so that the young have all spring and summer to grow, get food, and so forth. Frogs release hundreds of eggs, not thousands like a fish. So not as many eggs as a fish, but still a lot. Has anybody been like hiking around a stream or a pond and found frog eggs? What are they like?
Caviar.
They're like
Oh,
eyes.
they look like little, yeah.
Like, yeah, they look like eyes.
Yeah, they look like eyes. Are they all spread out, individual?
No, they're in one big clump.
They're in a big clump of jelly. Okay?
Caviar.
And, you know, there's an example. Those are some frog eggs the person's holding. And that jelly holds them all together so that they can be fertilized by the male. They're all in one place. and they'll grow and develop there. Each of those little dots, you said they look like eyes. Each of those little dark spots is a tadpole that will hatch eventually
Can you
and
touch 'em?
could possibly become, a frog if it can survive long enough. So that's how amphibians reproduce.
Like, can you bring some in and we can like touch them?
Not now, because they do reproduce in the spring, but if somebody finds some frog eggs this spring, bring some in and we'll check them out. We'll hatch them from
I
tadpoles
harvest
into
them.
frogs.
I harvest them.
Did you?
Come here.